Hey everybody, Seth with Jenson USA, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the language of brakes. In our overview of brakes today, we're not so much going to be looking at the specific brands and models of brakes, but more about the aspects, components, and tech built into them that bring out specific characteristics. So in this lineup, we have two major brands, SHIMANO and SRAM, but this applies to pretty much all the different brands and all the different models out there. And we're going to be kind of looking at what characteristics of these stand out. So on this end, we're kind of focusing on more of a cross-country trail type of brake. We have an enduro trail kind of brake here, and then a DH style brake on the end here. And the reason we have those is to talk about the different riding conditions that you might use the different styles of brakes for, as well as the different aspects or components of those brakes. So when we're talking about brakes, one of the biggest things you want to think about is heat dissipation, and that's because heat dissipation is going to affect both your power and your modulation of your brake, as well as your braking control overall. So the reason these are kind of different brakes is because of their manufacturing setup to start. So the first one here is a two-pot brake from SHIMANO, and that means two pistons, one on each side. We also have a four-piston setup here, and then another four-piston setup. So what's the difference between these? Well, a two-piston brake is going to apply less power than you would from a four-piston situation. That's okay in most cross-country and trail riding. You may not need all the power that you get from a four-piston brake, but if you're a bigger rider or you're charging harder, you may want to jump to a four-piston brake like we have here. Now, what sets this kind of enduro's brake differently from this downhill brake? Primarily, that's going to be piston size, and that just means that you're going to be able to provide even more power through the brake as your pistons get bigger. Now, the next piece to consider in brakes and heat management is going to be the type of brake fluid you have. So in the SHIMANO, we run mineral oil, and in the SRAM, we run DOT. If you look across brands, you'll see brands choosing between these two fluids often. So what's the major difference? Well, mineral oil is going to be non-caustic, generally pretty easy to work with. It's not going to do damage to your bike paint if you get it on your frame. You can just kind of wipe it off and clean it up real easily. But it's going to have a lower boiling point. So as you're riding, if you put it under heavy braking loads for long periods of time, you can actually introduce bubbles into the system by boiling that fluid inside of your caliper and hose line. Now on the DOT side, we're going to have a much higher boiling point on this, but it is a caustic fluid, so we definitely recommend using gloves and being really careful when you're bleeding your brakes with these, because it can damage your paint if you get this fluid onto your bike's paint or onto your skin. It can do damage. Use some alcohol to make sure you clean that off nicely. So the next thing in heat management is going to be caliper size as well. So you can see we have a somewhat small caliper starting over here, and as we go across, they actually get bigger. And that just gives more area for that heat to dissipate off. SHIMANO has done a few things to compensate for this, and that kind of brings us to their rotors itself. So if we're looking at these rotors here, we have two different types on display. We have a stamped rotor, which is basically a rotor that's stamped out of a sheet of steel. And then we have a two-piece rotor here that actually has this black carrier that then carries a piece of steel rotor on the outside there. And they actually get a little more complicated with some of the rotors offered from both SRAM and SHIMANO, where there can be aluminum cores inside the stamped steel, or it's like a layered steel with aluminum core. And again, that's just to manage that heat. And then SHIMANO throws a couple other things with their Freesia rotors, where they actually add finned pads onto the rotor itself. So they have these finned portions on there, and all of that is just to allow for more heat dissipation. It moves that across. One other way to deal with heat dissipation is actually to go to larger rotors. So you can see we have this small rotor here. That's great if you're doing kind of trail, maybe light enduro type of riding. But if you're a heavier rider, or if you're charging hard or doing long descents, you're going to want to step up to a bigger rotor. And while there is some mechanical advantage to a larger rotor being able to apply that power, the biggest component of a larger rotor providing more power is actually in the heat management. It's able to just displace that heat into the air and not into your brake pads or your brake fluid, and so you get longer braking times with more control. Now the next part is going to be brake pads. And we've got a couple of different examples here. You can see on this one we have fins coming out of it, whereas we don't have that on the SRAM ones. And again, that's the combination of dot fluid versus mineral oil. And that allows us to dissipate more heat from the mineral oil situation, whereas the SRAM brakes maybe don't need that quite as much, although you can do aftermarket stuff to add fins to these. So if that's what you're into, it's worth looking into. But yeah, we have a couple of different brake pad styles, and those fin pads really do work well at dissipating that heat. Now, another component of your brake control, heat management in your pads is going to be both the backing plate material and the brake pad material itself. So a aluminum backed plate will actually dissipate heat a little bit better, so you'll often see that in brakes that are having to manage heat dissipation a lot. Whereas steel will kind of hold on to that heat a little bit longer and not dissipate it quite as quickly. Now, the other component is that brake pad material. And generally in brakes that are more focused at hard charging and downhill, you'll often see the metallic material, which is also known as sintered. You'll see brakes that have to deal with a lot more hard charging braking being made of that metallic material. It also works great in wet and muddy conditions because it's not really affected by that water or the mud itself. And so they're a great choice if you're riding in kind of nasty conditions. So we definitely recommend metallic for heavier riders, wet and muddy conditions, or hard charging riding. Now in a brake like this is a cross-country brake that generally is going to not see hard charging riding as much as you would in a DH, but this actually comes with metallic brake pads. And the reason for that combo is because this is a two-pot setup. And so they're taking some of the strong braking power from the metallic pads and applying it into a system that is more designed for trail riding. So this is actually taking a little bit of what's good here, plus taking the lightness and the characteristics of a two-piston setup and applying it in a cross-country situation. Now, if you don't like brake noise or you want to have a little more modulation feel, you can also go to an organic pad or a resin pad. And what that does is it actually uses a different material that's softer and is going to give you just a better braking feel, more modulation, just kind of more control. But they don't last nearly as long as what we'd see on a metallic pad. And they are going to have much less squeal or noise, but not behave nearly as well in wet and muddy conditions. So an organic or resin pad is great for those dry conditions, more cross-country trail riding, maybe dipping into enduro, but doesn't quite do as well in a downhill situation. Now there is a brake pad that kind of lands in between, and these are called metallic or semi-metallic. And that's what you'll often find on a brake like this enduro brake. But again, it depends on the setup. So here we have a 4-piston setup, so a lot of braking power, but we use an organic pad. So it's about kind of managing the benefits, the performance of the pad against the power of the brake itself. So this is something that you can play around with and kind of figure out what works best. Now with that being said, when you do change out pads, if you've been running your other pads and bedded them in, your rotors themselves actually do get impregnated with the material from your brake pads. So you may not get the full performance of going to an organic pad after you've been using a metallic or semi-metallic, and vice versa if you just swap them. So it is a good idea to often, start with a new new rotor and new pads so that you can really get the best performance out of whatever scenario you pick here. So with that being said, if you need any more help with this, our gear advisors are waiting, ready to answer your questions about which brake setup is right for you. Remember, we have free shipping on orders over $50. And remember, keep pedaling.